Indrani, Bagchi, the CEO of Ananta Center. Henry Wilkinson, the Chief Intelligence Officer at Dragonfly, and Andrew Staples, the Principal of GeoPol Asia. If you'll take your seats, I'm just going to move my chair around just marginally so I can see you all a little bit better. Before we do come to you, Mary, I just want to ask you, as I was listening very closely to your address there, it is almost a little depressing that that margin doesn't really, I mean, on a good year you might get it to 5, but you're never going to get it much higher. What is the fundamental reason why?
Well, you know, I do think that our value chain is uniquely skewed, yeah, and we're squeezed in the middle. Airlines are price takers upstream in the value chain, where there are few suppliers,
right,
and they can impose their prices upon us. And downstream, we are competing mainly on price. So there's very little ability to influence how we price our products towards the clients. And I came from financial services, spent 30 years working for banks, where we have price transparency to, you know, among us on the screens, but never ever would we dream of turning the screen around and showing it to the client. Yeah, which is what we do in airlines. Yeah, all clients at all times can see all prices, and that's
right,
intense price competition. And airlines sit there in the middle and have limited power in either direction.
And not only do they have limited power, they are at the whim and wane of every crisis in the world in some shape or form. And the purpose of the next 45 minutes is for our learned guests to give us some vision and idea of what we expect those issues to be. So start with you, Henry. In terms of, I want to do the economics first, and then we'll go on to the geopoliticalization of it and the infrastructure and the conflict zones. But if we just look economically in terms of the risks that you see at the moment, what would it be? Henry.
In terms of economics, I mean, the areas that I specialize in are around conflict in particular,
right,
and tensions. So for me, I think particularly when you're looking at the industry as a whole, the big worry, I guess, is overflight risk and rerouting and the increased costs of that, particularly if trade is under pressure. And obviously, you were noticing the low oil price, which I think is a boon. So for me, the areas that I'm looking at in particular would relate to what is the future of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia? How is that going to change, and what is the outlook there?
I mean, we see a sizable economic implication of that.
Absolutely.
Even continuing with no obvious change in that. I just looked at my flight from New York to here, which of course takes longer. I did Japan to the UK a couple of months ago. Again, it's still considerably longer.
Absolutely. And if you look at the strategic corridor that's linking Europe to Asia, there's a number of hotspots and issues there which I think will present significant risks. And of course, I haven't even spoken about the broader trade policy with the Trump administration, which I'm sure the others will have much to say.
Let's go to the Trump administration.
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm based in Singapore, been based in Asia for the past 20-something years, and the whole topic of conversation there is Trump, trade and tariffs, and technology. So over the past few years, we've seen the weaponization of technology, which is a major issue given the sort of export orientation of those economies. And then more recently, particularly from Trump's second inauguration, the focus on trade and all the uncertainty and volatility that that's leading to when it comes to tariffs.
Right. Now, on this question of uncertainty, there are two aspects that I see can affect the industry. The first is a direct, if you will, trade. You're not carrying as much, when we talked about that in terms of cargo. But the second also can be, if the US is perceived to be an unfriendly place to visit, then you start to see a downturn in passenger numbers. Now, so far, the airlines are saying they're seeing minor effects on this. But as a potential risk, it could be quite considerable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're already seeing that. We hear anecdotally around, let's say, student tourism, let's say conferences, business travel in particular, and tourism. So there's a lot of risk around that. Just sort of going back to the point around how do you deal with some of this uncertainty? Because I think a lot of the conversation there has been around control what you can, and you can't control that bigger geopolitical picture, but you can control what you have internally. And that might be looking at where you are in your digital transformation journey, for example, controlling your costs, and doing all of that sort of foresight scenario work to help you understand and navigate those competing but plausible alternatives.
But on this trade issue, when you wake up in the morning, and the other day I woke up and suddenly found 50% tariffs on steel coming in later this week. And then you see Delta Airlines shifting its aircrafts they're delivering them to Asia, so they fly around a bit there, so they don't attract a tariff when they're brought into the United States. As an economic environment, it's becoming increasingly difficult for the industry.
Yes, I would say so. And it's not just for the airline industry, it's everybody related to all of that. So whether you're in manufacturing goods, it's your supply chains, and where are you going to rejig those supply chains? We've already had a lot of, particularly thinking about Asia, that China plus one strategy, which worked very well for places like Vietnam. You could say too well, given the sort of trade imbalance that they now got with the United States. So what's the next stage? What are the emerging
They
trade
couldn't win.
corridors?
They couldn't win, could they?
They could not, but we'll see what happens in July.
But it's changed. You see, the whole question of supply chain resilience that we looked at when COVID hit, for instance, is you realize your vulnerability because you were so vulnerable to one source for your manufacture, for your supplies, for your APIs, for your raw materials. So you then went into this friend-shoring business. With Trump in power in Washington, that is now dissipating because he wants everything to be reshored to America. That makes the entire conversation around uncertainty far more difficult than it used to be.
And it's simply not realistic.
Well, we don't see it as realistic.
Right, and one of the reasons I'll come to you in a second.
Thanks.
Although there may not be the immediate causal link to the industry, if other industries suffer,
yes,
then people don't travel. And the sort of the consequent effect is what can be so serious.
Indeed, and as Andrew spoke about the uncertainties of people going into the US right now, I think there was a figure of about a 14% drop in visits to the US from Europe in the last few months. I think you're going to see a lot more if this ban on foreign students take effect in the US.
Yeah, I just think that everybody, and obviously policymakers to begin with, should be crucially aware of the fact that the world is no longer a manufacturing economy. The world is a service economy. The whole world is over 64% of global GDP is in services. Maybe, almost 90% is services in the US. Less than 10% is manufacturing, yeah? So maybe this would give fuel to the reshoring and if you think that you need to increase that percentage.
Right, but the president has said that he's not talking about a return to old-style jobs. I'm not sure that's actually accurate or not, but he said he's talking about a digital return or an increase in a higher level of manufacturing. Take Marie first and then to yourself. Yes.
Yeah, so, and the digitalization of trade and services is amazing, yeah? If you look at global trade in that respect, 40% of global trade is services. Only 20% if you count what's actually crossing borders. So, this is, if we spent more money in the growth area of the economy, we would obviously have a greater return on that investment. It doesn't make any economic sense of spending a lot of money in the area that's shrinking and on the old model.
If I may just give a slightly different look at this, the fact is that we might be looking at a digital or a services economy, which is what we were, particularly, but there is manufacturing. The world was manufacturing always in China. Now you are taking that out, and Trump has said that you want to put manufacturing back in the US. How is he going to do that? And if you don't invest in manufacturing, a lot of your digital services, frankly, will just fall short.
Right, but whatever the end result, the sheer dislocation of the last 3 months is an incredible overhaul of what we'd all traditionally believe. The way I often describe it, particularly on the tariffs front, it's as if we've all suddenly been, I think probably 90% of the people in this room who have done any work on economics or business come from a relatively orthodox view that tariffs, unless targeted, are bad, or at least not advantageous. It's as if we've been told the world is flat, after all.
Yeah. So going back to the chart we saw with the average tariff rates,
yes.
You see them come down in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. That's the period of globalization. But all of that, all of the assumptions that underpin that, the global supply chains and so on, they've been upended. And it's the speed of this dislocation that I think is causing a lot of concern. And when I say the concern, what do we do? If we're running supply chains, where do we put our new factory? Do we move it out of China? Do we put it here? What is the tariff rate going to be? And is that going to be for the next 6 months or the next 6 years?
Or the next 6 minutes.
Or the next 6 minutes, indeed. So it's the pace of change. And first of all, the fundamental changes to the global economy. And then secondly, these very tactical changes that sort of occur on a change on a whim. So when you're thinking about your budgets, when you're thinking about your investments, when you're thinking about your longer term planning, there's a lot of sort of people holding their breath at the moment. And that collective holding of the breath means collectively the global economy starts to slow down.
And that's what we're seeing.
Yep.
We are seeing at the moment that slowdown in the economy, aren't we? And Henry?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the theme about the pace of change is a really important one when we're talking about, what does one do about this and how does one stay on top of it? I mean, the changes in the international order, and it was referenced earlier around multilateralism and the decline of the rules-based order. This is really happening, and it's happening extraordinarily quickly. And I think what's particularly difficult in terms of how do you manage the risk is that quite often it's this surprise element that Trump is really playing to. And I mean, I was in the Gulf when he did his trip just a few weeks ago, and it was astonishing sitting down and meeting with business leaders, and no one knew what was coming. And he was making announcements as he was there that was taking everybody by surprise. I remember sitting in a meeting and suddenly announced that he was going to lift sanctions on Syria, and everyone's phone started ringing in the room. And and I think this is a sort of thing that we have to look at.
How do you manage that sort of risk?
Well, precisely. And I think you have to really understand it. You have to really think about what are the scenarios and really game out those scenarios and start planning around them. Because it's extremely fast moving. But I think also as well, you've really got to dig into looking beyond the haste and the speed. Trump is moving to make deals quickly, very aggressively, very quickly. But these things actually take time. And the question is, at what point is he going to suddenly start hitting reality? Looking at, for example, he wants to go in and do deals with the GCC, and he's done a deal with Yemen, for example, with the Houthis, which is blindsided Israel. As just one geopolitical example. It's these sort of endless surprises that I think keep people guessing, and I think that what that creates is a paralysis of we have to wait and see how this is going to play out, or do we lose out? Do we lose the first mover advantage?
Is there a risk that these deals are smoke and mirrors? And the reason I say this, I mean, I know something about this, obviously, I cover every night on Quest Means Business. If you look at the UK trade deal with the US, it's a heap of crap, essentially. It is a few issues on beef and this, that, and the other, and an enormous amount of we will agree to discuss this in the future. And that's the same as the China deal. It actually gives very little. So bearing in mind what you've just said, that it does take years to deal, it takes years to negotiate non-tariff barriers away. Is there a risk we're all being hoodwinked?
So, go ahead.
Okay.
Either of you.
Okay. Well, you know, I mean, there is a fundamental geopolitical cause to all of this, and that is the US-China, or this fragmentation of global geopolitics, at the core of which is the US-China relationship. And how the US-China relationship moves is what will drive not just how your tariffs go, but how the world separates into geopolitical blocks. And you can see blocks being built up, at least on one side. You don't see the blocks being built up on the other side. And that increases the element of uncertainty and risk.
What do you mean by the two sides?
So, on the China side, you can see an anti-West alliance being built. There is the China, there's Russia, there's Turkey, there's Iran, but what you're not seeing on the US side is who are your actual allies?
Well, you could arguably say you're seeing the exact opposite, because the US has promptly offended most of its closest traditional allies.
So actually, I think on that point, this is the most interesting area to keep your eye on.
Yes.
What does the European Union do? What do those so-called like-minded countries throughout the Gulf, India, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, what do they do? When it comes, in practical terms, regulations and standards on, say, AI governance, on data governance and so on, which path are they going to go down? And previously, I mean, I was on a panel last week talking about East and West. I don't think there is an East and West. What is the West? Is that Europe or is that America? And what is the East? Is that China or is that Japan or Singapore or even India? So it is much more fragmented. But to your point earlier on, in that complexity, there's a lot of cost. On the other side of that equation, there's a lot of opportunity. So people who are really doing quite well out of volatility in financial services, for example, people who are doing very well in navigating supply chain complexity as it gets even more complex and politicized, there's a massive demand for their services, which I think goes back to the point around, you know, digitizing your business. You're going to be far more resilient the more digital you are.
So, so when you look at the supply chain, we've been talking about supply chain resilience, supply chain diversification since 2021. And we spoke about it in a different way, when certain allies or certain countries getting together to friend shores. Right. You're no longer looking at that. Say with the Quad, you were looking at building technology standards for the future. You're no longer looking at that. And that brings in a different element of uncertainty, because if you don't have somebody putting the rules of the road in place, how's the world going to work?
So, and I want to turn to conflict zones in just 1 second, because that always has the potential to throw everything out of the window. But until we get there, how much do you think we should or are entitled to plan on the basis of a post-4-year Trump presidency? In a sense, I'm not saying you write off the next 4 years, but I'm saying you hold your nose and manage it as best you can, lurching from crisis to crisis. But actually, you have to plan X ahead.
So just to go back to that point, that fundamental relationship, the US and China, let's not forget that Trump 1.0 put the tariffs on China. Joe Biden's administration didn't take them down, in fact, increased them in some areas. So you could say that that's a sort of fundamental. That's going to continue. Now, what is the tariff rate going to be, you know, for individual countries? Who knows? The 10% on everybody. But
they're not going away. Howard Luckness this weekend said, absolutely, tariffs are here to stay.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can make some of those assumptions. And with that uncertainty, that's a little bit of clarity that you're getting. And the more bits of clarity that we can get collectively, give us a way forward.
Conflict zone, I want to talk about, it's an awful phrase though, isn't it, conflict zones, to put it like that. But we know what we're talking, we know it when we see it. Yeah. And whether it be the Middle East with Gaza, whether it be Russia, Ukraine, or India, Pakistan at the moment.
Quite.
These are off the charts in terms of, because they have a safety element that comes paramount above everything else.
Absolutely. And when you look at a map of the world and you see how much aircraft rerouting is going on and how much doglegging around things to avoid conflict zones, and it's not just the immediate conflict zones, there's other problems as well, such as GPS spoofing in areas. I mean, if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, the Black Sea, navigating this route is a serious challenge, and it's very costly, of course. And right now, the last thing we need is another conflict, which is obviously why looking at Iran is so critical at the moment, because if you look at the routes coming over, if Iran was to enter into a conflict situation now, alongside, and we had that, of course, last year. There was that period where.
But you see, I was much taken.
Extremely impactful.
Knowing that we were talking about this today, I was much taken in the last 48 hours. You had Hegseth in Asia at the Singapore conference saying worried about Taiwan. And apparently overnight, you have the German minister saying that he believes Russia's going to take a run at a NATO country in the next 5 years.
Yes. Well, I think this goes to your question earlier about after a Trump administration, which is how do you plan around that? And I guess my question would be, or my challenge would be that I suspect that the word ceasefire will be the word of the year in geopolitics terms this year. The question is how enduring are those ceasefires and how convenient were those deals done? My fear is that what we're seeing is things are happening at such a pace. The Trump administration is leading these efforts to get all these wins, but at what cost? And how meaningful are these things? So can we count on these ceasefires to actually resolve the conflicts, or is it just putting a lid on things for now? Because that is very significant long-term.
There is a difference between ceasefire and stop fighting.
Yes.
Exactly.
And what we're seeing is stop fighting rather than ceasefire.
We're not looking at a stop fighting, because I don't think either of the conflicts that are in play right now are at a point where stop fighting is a possibility. If you look at what Ukraine did to Russia yesterday, I cannot imagine that peace conference in Istanbul having any traction on either side at all. So I don't see that, and I don't see how Trump is going to threaten his way to get a resolution on. Yes.
Can I just read you? I'm just going to find it. I'm not being rude when I.
No, that's fine.
I'm reading. This was a text sent to me overnight by a correspondent in Kyiv. Following on from that, he says, bearing in mind what we've just heard overnight and the way they attacked, and depending on your numbers, it's however many billion in planes, whatever. Jason writes to me, Ukraine has proven the concept they can train small drones to autonomously recognize and attack particular types of aircraft on the ground. Wondering if anyone's looked at the implications for global security, and a $600 FPV drone destroys a $100 million nuclear-capable jet. Discuss.
How much time have you got? Drones have fundamentally changed warfare, and I think this is an area that we're only really beginning to understand. And the proliferation of this technology is the barrier to entry is extremely low. And what this means is, I mean, when you've got drone capabilities in the hands of nation states like Ukraine, you'll see this level of innovation and audacity, which is really quite staggering. But we're also seeing this technology proliferating to non-state actors. Just recently, we saw attacks in the Sahel using drones, which is a new development. We hadn't seen this before. All of which carries significant implications because drones can reach into airfields, they can even threaten low-flying aircraft. So I think this is fundamentally changing.
Were you shocked overnight?
Yes, exactly. And drones are also contributing to GPS spoofing. That's a major factor in terms of countermeasures which affect civil aviation. So again, you've got a double threat. It's not just one thing. It's more than that.
In fact, if you look at the most recent conflict between India and Pakistan, I think what stood out for all of us was actually the lessons that the Indians took away from the Ukraine-Russia conflict, because what in a way defined that conflict was the layered air defense systems and jammers put forward by the Indians, learning a lot from how the Ukraine-Russia conflict has evolved, which has been interesting for a country like, I mean, an ancient, sort of a traditional fighting force like the Indian services being able to learn on the fly, so to speak. They made a mistake in the first day, so they lost aircraft. They turned around and they rectified their problems. That, in my view, is what the transition to this new form of warfare.
Right, but if this overnight is accurate, well, Zelensky himself said it, this had been planned for 18 months.
Yes.
I mean, it ranks alongside the Israel and the walkie-talkies in Lebanon. But that aside, the positioning, the execution, the then release of the material that shows. So over breakfast this morning, we are all watching those videos of those bombers being destroyed on the ground. And
just to sort of pick up
Trojan
on this.
horse warfare.
Sorry?
Trojan horse warfare.
Yes.
Britain has this strategic defence review comes out today. There'll be a lot in there of learning from the Ukraine conflict.
Yes.
And it just gives you another sort of layer of depth. When you talk about politics, economics, security, we're in a very different world. The world of warfare now, drone warfare and everything we've worked through Ukraine. If you think about Asia, Taiwan, blockades of Taiwan by China, they might not necessarily need to invade to achieve their aims and so on. But whether it's politics, economics, or security, we're in a different context now.
This is the hardest bit. Is it worse than before? And I think back to I think of the crises that I've covered over the decades. I think of the stories that one's covered. Is it actually worse now? Or are we merely hearing more about it faster and therefore being able to follow it in more real time? Is the risk greater?
The latter. The risk remains the same as it used to. Either whether it is nuclear, whether it is a takeover of a sovereign territory, but what you're seeing now is the technological leaps are so quick, and and countries being so much more able to adopt or adapt from other conflicts. That's the new level of uncertainty.
I'm not sure I agree.
Go on.
Please, you.
Oh no, let's have disagreement first. Go ahead.
I mean, from where I sit, I mean, looking around, like we right now there are around 50 active conflicts in the world today of various intensities. There are about 20 crisis flashpoints globally. This is at least according to our analysis that we've done. And I think what is changing is, I agree completely about the technology, and I think that is changing the threshold. But what worries me is that the normal systems for managing and preventing conflicts from occurring in the first place, or helping recovery from them and mediate, and all of these systems and frameworks are being smashed or unraveled. And there is a lack of leadership, and there's also a lack of capacity.
Lack of hang on, you say lack of leadership.
Lack of leadership, absolutely.
At what level?
Well, at the highest level. I mean, if you look at the United States,
they would say they're giving perfect leadership. They would say they would say exactly the opposite. They would say they've set out the terms, they've led the way. If people choose not to come to the table and negotiate, they cannot be responsible if the horse won't drink when taken to water.
But
please go ahead.
The main conclusion I feel today is that everybody has drawn this conclusion that we have to spend more on military equipment and infrastructure and military people. So this increased military spending comes with a huge opportunity cost for the global economy. Yeah. So we're going to have less growth in the future, less quality growth, and we're going to forego tackling all the other issues, obviously including climate change. So I think that's definitely deplorable, and we should try to avoid being manipulated emotionally. I think we are totally being manipulated. Let me just get this one in. You know, when we jack up tariffs to 150% and then bring them down to 30% maybe, or 10%, yeah, and think that that's good. You know, it's sort of like how I feel about my personal weight, yeah? I go high up and then I go down to something lower, but it's still higher than it was, yeah? And that I feel better is obviously mental and
that 10% tariff, general tariff, is 3 times
Yeah.
the previous average tariff.
Exactly.
And if you'd said to anybody a year ago, we're going to have a 10% general tariff around the world, you'd say you're barking mad.
Absolutely.
But I think that the question of
Right.
tariffs is really important to your question that you had, which is that what we're seeing is that this decoupling of nations, the reduction of these economic interdependencies, is really critical. And the reason for that is, one, because it removes incentive for peace, but two, it also blunts the effect of sanctions. And sanctions are the primary sort of peaceful or peaceable
Right.
tool for deterring conflict and trying to bring it to a resolution. So when sanctions are off the table and economic independence is falling, what are the tools of statecraft? And this is where I think, and the big question to your, I know that we were talking about this, about what do you do about it, or what are the challenges, is that we can all look around and look at the geopolitical risks. And we all know where they are. Most people read the news and they're pretty alert to it. The real challenge is, how do they manifest? What are the vectors? And that is where the real surprises come. That is where it requires a level of fluidity and currency of knowledge around what's happening that is very, very difficult to maintain, because war has been taken essentially off the battlefield because the stakes are too high and taken into these grey zones. And that is, I think, a very important area to talk about.
There's one area I want to just talk about before we, and that is, it's related to warfare, but it is cyber. And you're talking about the speed up with digitization and all that, but of course with that comes an inherent risk of greater. I was, as I think many were in the UK, quite shocked when I heard just how much the malware cyber attack is going to cost Marks and Spencers. Mm-hmm. And when I heard the number of 400 million, and then casually somebody said, oh, and the co-op's also in there as well. And then you've got Walmart and everybody else who's also, in some shape or form, suffering the same. This is a dirty little secret war, in a sense, because nobody really wants to face up to it.
Yeah, and it's growing exponentially. Year on year, there's more being spent by criminals and more on defense as well. But if you, again, boil some of that away, technology sits at the heart of this. And if you go back to that relationship between the United States and America, fundamentally, it's about who controls that cutting-edge technology. Those chips that are designed by NVIDIA and are made by TSMC that can power the latest cutting-edge chips that you need to build your AI systems, but also go into missile guidance systems. So everything, whether it's cybersecurity or whether it's great power rivalries and so on, you can boil that down in this particular era to technology. Who has ownership or who's leading in those areas? That's going to give you the opportunity, we heard the phrase, the rules of the road, to set what those rules of the road are.
Well,
go ahead.
I think the fault here, and I would put that, frankly, at China's doorstep, because it was when China weaponized not just technology, it weaponized manufacturing, it weaponized exports, that you were forced to respond with a geopolitical response, which is like, okay, you are definitely not going to be a partner because you've gamed the trading system for 2 decades, you've now gamed the technology system, and so everybody around is now responding in geopolitical terms.
And yet half the world, but to your earlier point, China may have gamed all that, but a large part of the world is trying to get on board with China at the same time.
Really?
You
Some part. I wouldn't say the large part.
I mean, certainly China's built out its influence around the world. The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, the physical infrastructure, digital Silk Road and so on. But then also in terms of trading relationships, most countries in the world, for many, I think pretty much every country in Asia, China is the biggest trading partner. That gives them influence.
And every country in this region, both in Africa and Asia, etc., are all looking for an alternative. Yeah. Whether it is alternative to India, whether it is an alternative to China, whether it is an alternative to the US. That fact, that basic fact of hedging is now an entrenched aspect of both economic and geopolitical practice. And that, you can see that.
In this environment, and I'll come back to aviation just to finish in a second, but in that environment where the US, in the eyes of some, is an unreliable partner, or at least a mercurial partner, is stability a currency much sought after now? People want to know how your trading partners, your defense partners, even if you don't agree with them, you do want to know that they're taking the same position next week that they took last year and they'll take in a year's time.
And I think the question that you're asking is, will you still be geopolitically on my side of the field? And therefore, do I need to hedge against you? I think that would be a bigger question than, will you be on my side economically? Because a lot of economics, a lot of trade choices, a lot of technology choices are now dependent on your geopolitical choices.
I want to come back to you, Marie. Having heard the discussion, do you see any hope that this industry can increase its 3.7% margin, bearing in mind what our panelists have been saying, and bearing in mind they have sketched out elegantly and eloquently the risks?
No, I mean, I do think that this is sort of the gazillion million dollar question, to use a technical phrase, and would propose that we ponder for an instance then our supply chain, because our supply chain is already malfunctioning before we're even mentioning tariffs and geopolitical issues. Yeah, today we think that we're 5,400 aircraft short. And that'll take 3 to 5 years to sort out that problem, again, before any tariffs. So, you know, this is a uniquely capital-intensive industry with extremely long lead times between the concept of an aircraft and it actually being able to be purchased in the best of times. And I think that what I really would want for our industry and for the global economy is that everybody understands the multiplier effect of air transportation. And I think India has understood the multiplier effect of air transportation. And if that were sort of more commonly acknowledged, policies would fall into their logical right place. Right. And we could have a better economic outcome than the road that we have been discussing.
I want to end on a more positive note. So
that was positive.
Sorry?
That was positive.
Can I just pick up on that? Because I think that speaks to the issue of control what you can. Within this sector, there seems to be a lot that you can control and get done, regardless of what's going on in the White House. That's the same for NATO and defense spending, it's the same for ASEAN and reducing internal barriers to trade and so on. So it seems to me that there's potential there to be doing what you can.
Give me one note of hope. Start with you, sir. One note, what's the one problem you don't expect to happen next year?
Oh, God.
What's going to come off the table, not on it? You can say nothing at all.
That's very hard to say. There's so many moving parts at the moment. But one thing I would say that I think is positive is that looking particularly at Europe and the Strategic Defence Review, which you've just mentioned, is that there doesn't seem to be complacency. There's a recognition that the world is changing, and it is changing, and it's not going back. And I think that meeting the moment is the key.
So, what's one thing that you think will be off the table next year? One solved problem.
I'll put it the other way. I think what will be on the table is deeper integration between like-minded countries, and that will be good. So looking at those links with Europe, GCC, India, Southeast Asia, there's a lot of countries that actually want to support a global rules-based order without this whiplash from the States.
Come on, you're getting the last word. You've got to send us off to lunch with at least some hope.
I think we are looking at more of the same. I don't see too many things that get off the table because I don't think we've even approached the question of where we are in terms of geopolitical alignment. We thought we were there. We no longer are.
Marie?
Yeah, everybody wants to fly, so it'll happen.
The planes will still take off. They may go a longer distance, they may go around things, but they'll still fly.
Absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, our panel, thank you.
Thank you.